Welcome to the AJEX presentation on today Yom HaShoah. We would like to take some time now to remember those who were liberated from the Nazi concentration camps and death camps, and also to commemorate their liberators, many of whom were Jewish servicemen and women serving with the Allied forces that were there to defeat Nazi tyranny. When Germany attacked Poland in September 1939, the whole world was horrified, although German aggression was nothing new. However, this time, many of those in Europe who had allowed Nazis' expansion decided that things needed to change, and war was declared on Germany. Britain immediately had to introduce conscription. It had a relatively small regular forces and was aware that actually they would not be sufficient to counter the German attack. Therefore, conscription was introduced, and all would be required to do their bit over the coming months and years. There was to be no exemptions to the call of conscription. Nobody was to be exempt due to religion, race, colour, or background. But that didn't really matter to Anglo Jewry. Anglo Jewry had fought and been proud to serve during the previous World War and had served in numbers over 50,000, disproportionate to its size as a community in the UK and the Commonwealth and Empire. This time, however, its dedication and determination to call was even greater. Many Jews in the UK had friends or relatives living abroad in Europe. Many had known some of the new Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria who had arrived into the UK in the previous years. Everybody had read the reports in the newspapers that were explicit about what the Nazis intended to do to Jews in their regions. This time, the Jewish community was determined to serve not just out of duty and with a sense of determination, but this time they were even keener to serve to try and end the anti Semitism that had taken over Europe in a wave of hatred and seemed to be far worse than anything that had ever gone before it. AJEX, the Association of Jewish Sex Servicemen, had been formed to help those who had served during the First World War and to ensure that all of society knew of the contribution that Anglo Jewry had made. This time round, AJEX would be there to support this new generation from the start. And it was clear it was going to need to do that because Jews stepped up to serve in all aspects that they were required. In the armed forces, the Army, the Royal Navy, and the Royal Air Force all had Jewish servicemen and women. They would serve in the Merchant Navy, the medical services, the new women's military units, the ATS, the RAF, and the RENs. They would serve on the land as part of the Land Army, and those who were unable to serve in armed units or on the land would still be in their communities acting as air wardens and fire wardens. They would join the police and the fire brigade. There would be no aspect of home service or military service that Anglo Jewry was not prepared to step up and be a part of. After all, the stories coming out of Europe about the atrocities against the Jewish populations there were getting stronger, and more and everything had to be done to try and stop the Nazis from achieving their aims to remove the Jews from the whole of Europe. By 1945, in excess of 70,000 Jews had served in the British forces alone. That included Jews from the Commonwealth and Empire and those from Palestine. Those Jewish men and women had fought determinedly to try and defeat Nazism, but they were now about to approach one of their biggest battles. As Allied troops were moving into Germany and across the occupied territories, some of their worst fears were being realised. Soldiers who were used to hardened battles, who had seen, they thought, the worst of what war meant, were about to face even worse situations. Now they would be asked to enter into the camps that the Nazis had used to destroy people. And that task, the liberation of camps, although it was good to ensure that the killing was being stopped, would also open up a box of horror and tragedy that nobody, no matter how battle hardened, could possibly have imagined. And amongst those liberators, when they entered into the camps from the Allied forces, were Jewish soldiers. They were no more prepared than any of the other men around them for what they were about to witness. Nobody who was a liberator of a camp ever forgot what they saw on entering those places, and for some, it would change their lives forever. In Eastern Europe, it had been Soviet armies that had liberated what was left of the death camps and the concentration camps. In Western Europe, it would be the Allied forces of Britain, America, Canada, Free French, and others who would make their way across Germany and discover the horror of the Nazi legacy. The British troops were in an area of Germany near Celle, and they were asked to enter into a place called Bergen Belsen, a camp where there had been a typhus outbreak, and the Nazis didn't want it to spread to the local German population. No amount of news reports, no amount of announcements would prepare the liberators from Britain for what they were about to see. Amongst their number were Anglo-Jewish soldiers. For them, they would not only be horrified, but there would be a real personal understanding that all for geography, all for being a part of their British forces, that their Jewishness tied them to the men and women who had been tortured in those camps. And for all their own security, they knew it had only been, in many cases, luck and geography that had spared them from that fate with their brethren across Europe. When the British forces entered into Bergen Belsen, they were horrified with what was there. There were 60,000 inmates approximately still alive, but there were 13,000 who had already perished and lay around unburied. That did not include the thousands more who had died at that camp in the previous months and years. Bergen Belsen wasn't even a death camp. It was a concentration camp at the end. And prior to that, it had been a holding camp and an exchange camp. But in the end, it had seen just as much horror and death as anywhere else. The British forces were appalled with what greeted them. They quickly closed off the camp, brought in medical units to try and do what they could, and individual servicemen tried their best to help those who had been placed in that camp for nothing other than what they had been identified as Jewish. They got their supplies, they got their friends to donate food, often with terrible consequences, but they hadn't known that. What they'd wanted to do was try and solve a situation. They forced the German guards to bury the dead, and they began to bring in aid where they could. For the Jewish liberators, the desire to help was overwhelming. They had to try and do something. And for Jewish servicemen near and far, Bergen Belsen and then later places such as Buchenwald and Dachau would become places that they wished to visit, not as sightseers ever, but to bear witness to the horror, to be part of those who would hold that memory and ensure it would not be forgotten. One British serviceman was in the area of Celle. He'd been deployed there as part of a unit. He'd also been one of those who had landed on the Normandy beaches a couple of days after the invasion. Along with his team, he had fought his way across Europe. He'd been part of the supply chain, ensuring that the Allies could reach Germany and defeat the Nazis on their own ground. That man was Mervyn Kirsch. He came from South London to a strong, settled Jewish family. He didn't speak Yiddish. He didn't think of himself as being anything other than a normal South London Jewish lad. He joined up to do his bit, and he was proud of what he was doing. But whilst he had a little bit of leave, he decided to travel just a few miles down the road and visit the place called Bergen Belsen, a place he had heard about but couldn't believe really could exist. We were fortunate enough to interview Mervyn, who's still alive. He's still an active AJEX member, and he has told us what he saw when he went on those visits. Despite his British service uniform, Mervyn was not allowed entry into the camp when he got there. Such was illness and disease in the camp and the conditions that the British authorities had closed the camp to entry to anybody other than essential staff. But by this stage, there were some survivors who were able to stand by the fences and talk to people, those who had come near the camp. And through this, Mervyn chatted to people. They spoke a multitude of languages, he did not. But through a little bit of French, as well as his English, and the universal language of sign language, he was able to establish a rapport with some of them. He chatted to them about where they were from, what they had experienced, and he was appalled by what he heard. He also asked them about what they wanted to do, what was their future, where were they going to go. And he was struck at the time by the fact that all bar a small handful had only one dream now, and that dream was to reach Israel. Even though the state was yet to be established, that was their dream. and that's what they told him they wanted to do. After the first encounter, Mervyn Kirsch was rightly shocked by what he'd seen, and he went back to speak to some of those around him, some of the other servicemen he served with, non-Jews, but people who also were shocked by what they were discovering as they entered into Germany. He, as part of his rations, received a bar of chocolate and cigarettes each week. He didn't smoke, and he always exchanged his cigarettes anyway for other chocolates. He now convinced those around him to also give up their chocolate rations, and armed with as much food as he could, he went back to the camps to distribute it. Of course, we know today, and he found out many years later, that that may not have been the rightful course. Food rich in those kind of calories and dairy could have done unknown damage to people. But he hadn't done it with any malice. He'd done it because he wanted to be able to do something in his limited ways. And the people who received those gifts were grateful. They were grateful that the outside world seemed to care. They were grateful to meet a Jewish serviceman in uniform who was prepared to help them. And that legacy, that impact was important. Those memories have stayed with Mervyn Kirsch for over 75 years, and he is still able to reflect on them today. Mervyn was rightly horrified by what he'd seen and what he'd heard about the sufferings that had gone on in Bergen Belsen. When the British had liberated the camp and found the thousands unburied and the thousands suffering and being tortured in their starvations, thousands continued to die despite everybody's best efforts. They couldn't be saved, but the memory of them could, and people like Mervyn became part of a new determination, a determination to ensure that those people would not be forgotten, a determination to ensure that Anglo Jewry, AJEX, would stand by their memories and would stand by no longer for any anti-Semitism. As a member of AJEX, as a member of the British Armed Forces, Mervyn was determined to make what he had seen matter. And he was not alone. There were other Jewish men, servicemen and women who were at Bergen Belsen. And in their own way, they also decided that they would do something alongside AJEX to ensure that what they had seen, what they had witnessed, would be known by all. Sergeant Norman Turgel would meet Gina in the camp. Gina was a Polish Jew who, along with her family, had been forced into the ghetto and then into concentration camps. She'd lost her siblings, but her mother still survived with her, and they had been transferred to Bergen Belsen. There, Gina had worked in the hospital. Well, if you could call it a hospital, it was mainly a place to go and die. But through her work there, she was able to save herself and her mother. After liberation, she found herself talking to Norman. He was surprised to fall in love. And yet, even in those depths of places where horror had occurred, the human spirit survived. And Norman Turgel married Gina. The first Jewish wedding in a camp between a liberator and a survivor. Also at Bergen Belsen, ready to bear witness forever, was the Reverend Hardman. He had been a Jewish chaplain who had gone in with the forces in the days following the liberation. He was horrified by what he saw and went on record many times to tell people that these things should never happen again. Both Norman and the Reverend Hardman were keen supporters and members of AJEX. They channeled their desire to ensure that the likes of Gina and those of her family and the many millions of Jews of Europe would not be forgotten by ensuring that anti-Semitism would be stopped wherever it was found, and that the remembrance of all those people would never be cast aside. Those men are symbolic of those we remember today as well. That there are many who would go to all lengths to ensure that the memory of the Jews of Europe is kept alive, and the horror that they lived through will not be repeated again. AJEX was formed to help the men who'd served in the First World War and to help support their families. It was formed to remember military service. It was formed to ensure that the rest of society would be educated about the contribution that men and women had given for their country. But the Holocaust changed AJEX. More importantly, the men and women who witnessed the Holocaust changed AJEX. They didn't change those central three pillars because they are important. But what they changed, perhaps, was the focus. They changed the determination, and they changed forever AJEX's belief that its job wasn't just to remember its own members. Its job wasn't just to educate about its own sacrifice and service, but was also there to remember those who had been murdered by Nazi Germany, and to ensure that those who had fought against those murderers should be remembered. It was there now to educate not just about service and duty and contribution, but to educate those people who would dare to think that anti-Semitism was acceptable, to condemn that anti-Semitism. They became educators in remembrance and action. And that is still AJEX's legacy today. Those men and women who bore witness all those years ago helped shape the organisation that it has become, and have shaped what it will be in the future as an organisation that is active in remembering duty, but also active in ensuring that Jewish contribution is important to all society and will not allow detractors or anti-Semites to stamp on the memory of those who serve. AJEX is an organisation that is a family. We are a family of veterans and their families, and we are part of the military family of current servicemen and women. And we are proud of the contribution our members make and have made in defeating enemies. And we are proud of the contribution that our members made to ensure that the events of the Shoah would not be forgotten. And today we rededicate our determination to ensure the Holocaust, the Shoah, is remembered. And also we rededicate our pledge, as always, to ensuring that anti-Semitism is defeated wherever it may try to raise its head. But right now, as a military family, we come together to reflect on those that were liberated, the liberators, and those who were tragically murdered but not forgotten.